Before we begin, take a deep breath. Let it out slowly. Make yourself comfortable. If you're lying in bed, pull the blankets close. If you're listening during a quiet moment, let your mind settle. This is your time to rest, reflect, and drift. As the outside world dims, you don't need to hold on to every word. This story is here to keep you company, whether you stay awake for all of it or gently fall asleep somewhere along the way. Tonight we're heading far north, to a world carved by ice and ruled by long shadows. To the rugged homelands of the Vikings, where snow falls heavy and silence clings to the pine trees, where winter didn't just visit, it took hold, and once it arrived, it stayed. We often imagine Vikings as fearless warriors, raiding by sea or boasting in great halls, but behind those stories was a harder truth. Life in the north was brutal, and winter, especially winter, was unforgiving. This is the story of how Viking winters weren't just cold, they were cruel. Of how families huddled in smoky homes, how food ran low, how fear whispered in the winds outside the door. This is why winters were even worse for Vikings. Let's begin. In the Viking Age, which stretched roughly from the late 700s to the 11th century, most people in Scandinavia lived close to the land. They raised livestock. They grew barley, rye, and oats. They hunted and fished when they could. And they worked hard during the warmer months to prepare for what came next. Because once the snow started falling, usually in October, it didn't stop. Not really. It piled higher and higher until it blanketed homes and fields and boats. The sun barely rose above the horizon, casting only a faint silver glow over the land before vanishing again. And the days were short. Sometimes just a few hours of grey light. The rest was darkness. Inside their wooden longhouses, Viking families gathered together. Men, women, children, animals. These homes were built low to the ground, with turf or sod roofs and thick wooden walls. They were warm, in their way, but also smoky and dim. There were no windows. The fire in the center of the room gave light and heat, but it also filled the air with smoke. The smell of wet wool, burning wood, and unwashed bodies was constant. People slept side by side on raised platforms, wrapped in furs. The same breath that formed frost on the walls during the night would rise as mist in the morning. And they waited. They waited for the snow to stop. They waited for the days to lengthen. They waited for spring. But waiting through winter was not passive. It was a season of survival and anxiety. Food was stored in pits or outbuildings, but it often spoiled or ran short. Meat dried too slowly in damp air. Grain got moldy. Root vegetables froze. If a storm destroyed the stores or rats got to them, a family might not make it through February. Even salted fish, a staple in coastal areas, wasn't a guarantee. If the catch had been bad that year, if the salting hadn't been done properly, if the storage was poor, there would be consequences. Quiet, gnawing ones. So Viking families rationed. They ate less. They stretched broth with water. They ground tree bark into flour when the grain ran low. They boiled bones twice, 3 times, for every last bit of fat and marrow. Children were often hungry. The elderly were quiet. The sick rarely recovered. And still the snow fell. It was not uncommon for neighbors to pass away unnoticed until spring, their homes sealed shut by drifts of snow and silence. No smoke from the chimney. No footprints on the path. There was also the cold. It wasn't the kind of cold that bites once and goes away. It was a constant presence, in your bones, in your breath, in the wind that seeped through the cracks in the walls. Boots made of hide would stiffen and freeze overnight. Hands would blister from firewood chores. Nose tips turned black. Frostbite was not a term they knew, but it was something they lived. Blankets were precious. Wool was coarse. Fur was rare unless you hunted or traded for it. The wealthy might have cloaks of fox or bear or wolf, but the average farmer? They had layers. Rough spun cloth and hopes that the wind would stay low. And always, always, the fire had to stay lit. If the fire went out in the night, the room would freeze. Reigniting it was hard. Dry kindling was scarce. And so someone always watched it. A mother, a child, an elder. Keeping the flame alive was a quiet, sacred act, a kind of prayer in itself. Outside the longhouse, the world was blank and still. Fields that once buzzed with bees and rang with the laughter of children were now buried under snow and silence. The fences disappeared first, then the trees seemed to draw closer. The familiar world reshaped by winter's heavy hand. Travel between farms or villages became rare. Paths were obscured, rivers froze, roads turned treacherous with ice. If someone fell ill and needed a healer from another settlement, the journey was not guaranteed. Sometimes even messengers didn't return. Isolation set in, and with it came a different kind of cold, not the kind that chilled the fingers, but the kind that settled in the spirit. Days passed without sunlight. The long nights bred anxiety, restlessness, and sadness. Today we might call it seasonal depression, but for the Vikings, there was no word for it. Only a heaviness that hung in the room like smoke. Storytelling became essential, not just for entertainment, but for endurance. The sagas, tales of gods and giants, heroes and monsters, were told again and again beside the hearth. They weren't just fiction, they were lifelines. They reminded people that the cold would pass, that the gods had suffered too, that even Odin had wandered in darkness. Sometimes elders sang old songs. Children listened, curled in fur, their eyes wide. And for a moment, the walls of the longhouse seemed to hold back the winter entirely. But still, the storm howled outside. Religious rites were important during these months. The ancient Norse believed that winter was not just a season, but a realm of spirits. That darkness had a will, that the gods watched closely in these times. Some believed that evil spirits were stronger in the cold, able to slip in through open doors or cracks in the wood. To protect themselves, families carved protective symbols into their doorframes. Charcoal markings, runes, little talismans tucked in corners of the room near the fire or over where the children slept. In December, during the time of Yule, a midwinter festival that predates Christmas, people made sacrifices. Sometimes animals like a boar or a goat. Occasionally, more grim offerings were made, especially if the harvest had been poor or the sickness had lingered too long. These sacrifices were not made with joy. They were made with desperation, with hope that the long dark might end just a little sooner. They drank ale in memory of the gods, they lit fires to honor the ancestors, and they waited for the sun to return. Spring did not come easily. Even when the snow began to melt in April or May, the land remained stubborn and cold. The soil had to thaw, the animals had to be coaxed from shelter. Some years it took until June before true warmth returned. And when it did, not everyone made it to see it. Mothers sometimes emerged from longhouses with fewer children than they had in autumn. Widows stepped out alone. Graves were dug where the snow had retreated. Simple stones marked the names. But life resumed. Ploughs were pulled across the damp ground. Boats were patched and sent to sea. Children ran barefoot again, and the stories of the long winter became quieter, like echoes in the trees. And yet, every year, the people prepared once more, because the next winter was already coming. There was a wisdom in Viking winter preparation that modern minds might overlook. They knew the cold could not be beaten, only respected. Outsmarted, perhaps, through planning. Endured, certainly, through community. Before the first frost, the entire village worked together. Every able hand was tasked. Timber was chopped and stacked, not just for warmth, but for cooking, drying clothes, boiling water to clean wounds. Meat was salted and fish dried on wooden racks. Turnips, onions, and cabbage were buried in earth pits, kept just above freezing, preserving life for leaner months. Wool was spun. Sails were patched. Roofs were checked for leaks. Even door hinges were oiled to keep out the bite of ice. Children helped too. They gathered twigs and moss for kindling. They fed the livestock while it was still safe to venture outdoors. They learned from watching, not just how to survive, but how to endure with grace. These were lessons passed quietly between generations. There were no complaints. Suffering was not something to protest, it was something to prepare for. And even in this hardship, there were rituals of peace. At dusk, when the chores were done and the world outside turned slate grey, families gathered around the hearth. Not in silence, but in rhythm. Someone tending the fire, another combing wool, someone else murmuring a prayer in the old tongue. They did not waste words, but the warmth of presence, of being together, that was its own language. And when things became most dire, when the animals grew thin, when the grain bags sat empty, when the cold crept even beneath the furs, there was one final tradition: sharing. Even the poorest Viking households understood. A winter survived alone was not a winter survived at all. If one family had dried meat and another had firewood, they bartered. If someone lost a cow, neighbors brought goat's milk. A sick child meant extra herbs from the healer's pouch freely given. They were not saints, but they knew that generosity wasn't charity. It was survival. Because the snow fell on everyone, and if one roof caved in, all the others could follow. So they stood together, leaned on each other, sang together, grieved together, waited, with patience passed down like heirloom tools. And eventually, after all the hunger, the darkness, the wind and fear, the sun rose again, soft at first, then stronger. Until the white world melted and the green crept back in, slowly, almost apologetically. Spring always came too slowly for the Vikings. It arrived first as a whisper, a slight change in the way the snow crunched underfoot, a faint drip from the eaves of the longhouse, a different smell in the air, not warm, not yet, but no longer bitter. To a Viking family that had survived the full weight of winter, this shift was more than seasonal. It was spiritual. It was proof that their suffering had not been in vain, that life had not abandoned them beneath the ice. And still, they did not rush. Spring was not a door that flung open. It was a long-awaited visitor, knocking softly. The rivers thawed slowly like breath held too long. Ice broke apart not in great cinematic crashes, but in delicate, almost embarrassed shivers. Sap began to run in trees long thought asleep. Even with the signs of thaw, food remained scarce. The final weeks of winter were, in many ways, the most dangerous. This was the season of hunger madness, when the stored fat was gone and what little grain remained had to be rationed like gold dust. It was a test not only of endurance, but of restraint. The temptation to gorge on the first fresh catch, or to eat seed grain meant for planting, could mean ruin. Those who survived did so with wisdom older than memory. Elders, their hair white with frost, their hands trembling from seasons too many, reminded the young to wait, to be patient. They told stories at the hearth, not of heroes, but of famines survived, of wolves chased away by fire, of women who gave their portion to children and lived to see another spring. These tales were their legacy, not sagas carved into stones or sung by skalds, but the quiet truth of how life was truly preserved. And so, with aching limbs and cautious hope, they turned toward the earth. The first task of spring was not celebration, but repair. Everything had suffered in the cold. Axes were dulled, thatch torn loose by wind, sleds worn thin from hauling firewood. But worst of all was what the ice did to the fields. The soil, once tilled and planted with care, was now packed hard with frost and scattered with stones forced upward by the freeze. The Vikings called this the heaving of the earth, and it was both a marvel and a curse. But still they worked, fathers and sons, mothers and daughters. Together they walked the land with tools in hand and determination in their breath. They stooped low to collect rock after rock, piling them at the edges of fields like offerings to a fickle god. They broke the soil with wooden plows and iron tips, their arms shaking from a winter spent surviving instead of building strength. The work was not quick, it was not easy, but it was alive. Every cut into the soil was a declaration, we are still here. And that, more than anything, was the Viking soul. It was not their violence, not their raids, not the burning of monasteries. It was this stubborn refusal to vanish, even when the cold tried to erase them. This willingness to kneel before the land and say, we will try again, even after a winter that cracked bones and tested faith, even after hunger had hollowed cheeks and taken the old. Even then, they sowed the seeds. As the days grew longer, the village slowly came back to life. Children, who had spent the winter curled beneath blankets or huddled near the hearth, began to wander again. Their boots splashed in the slushy paths that wove through the melting snow, their laughter timid at first, as if they, too, were unsure if joy had survived the frost. The elders took their stools outside for the first time in months, their eyes squinting in the unfamiliar brightness of the spring sun. They spoke little, their silence shaped by the ghosts of those who had not made it through the winter, but their presence alone was comfort. In the Viking world, every year lived was a quiet victory, and while spring brought warmth, it did not erase the cold. The sea remained a deep and dangerous thing, vast, unknowable, and cold to the bone. But with the thaw came the return of the boats. Not the warships that poets sang of, but small, sturdy vessels with patched sails and weathered wood, rowed by men with raw hands and hopeful hearts. They went out not for glory, but for cod. Fish meant survival. The first successful catch of the season could feed a household for days. It was a gamble with the sea, one the Vikings took willingly, not out of greed, but out of need. And when the men returned, their nets heavy and their cheeks stung red by salt and wind, the whole village would gather to help. Children ran to haul baskets. Women cleaned and salted the fish with practiced hands. Nothing was wasted. Bones were boiled for broth, skins were dried for tools or trade. It was not celebration, not yet, but it was relief. A kind of sacred routine, formed not in temples but in tides. Soon, the scent of damp earth and smoke gave way to something sweeter. Wild herbs peeked through the thawing ground, thyme, sorrel, angelica. These were not luxuries but lifelines. They added flavor, yes, but more than that, they were medicine. After a winter of dried meats and stored grains, the body craved green. The Vikings knew this instinctively. Long before science gave it names, they knew that the return of plants was the return of health. And still, they lived close to danger. The land was never tamed. The forest at the edge of the village whispered with things unseen, wolves, spirits, memories. The hills still held snow in their shaded creases, and storms could roll in with little warning. A single cold night could kill a weak child. A misstep in the mud could break a leg, and there were no doctors here. Only midwives and bone setters with steady hands and whispered prayers. But fear was not their companion. Familiarity was. They knew the risks. They carried them like tools on their belts. They had survived too many winters to expect safety. What they wanted was not comfort, but continuity. The chance to keep going, to plant, to raise, to harvest, to be remembered. In their stories, the worst thing was not death. It was being forgotten. And so they carved their names into stones. They passed down bracelets and knives. They told stories not of riches, but of endurance. The winter when the roof collapsed, the year the fish didn't come, the night they fed strangers even when their own plates were empty. These were their myths, quiet ones, true ones. And as the seasons shifted, the Vikings marked the days not with grand ceremonies, but with soft, consistent rituals. The lighting of a new hearth fire, the tightening of leather bindings on a still-worn pair of boots, the mending of a fishing net passed down from a father to his son. These were not just chores, they were testaments to survival. Each task was a whispered promise to the future, a way of saying, we are still here. The longhouse, once sealed tight against blizzards, now welcomed the scent of damp wood and thawing soil. Families would gather in the evenings around the central fire, the smoke curling gently toward the open vent above. Children would sit with heads in laps, eyes drooping as old stories returned to fill the spring air. But these weren't tales of glory and conquest. Not always. Sometimes they were about a woman who kept a goat alive all winter on stored oats and dried moss, or the boy who found a sprouting onion beneath the ice and gave it to his mother instead of eating it himself, or the dog who stood guard by the door each night, even as snow piled against his back. In these stories, kindness was heroism, endurance was honor, and warmth, real warmth, was earned, not given. Outside, the rivers began to move again, sluggish at first, then quick with meltwater. The sound of running water was almost shocking after so much silence. It filled the air with life. The first birds returned, chirping not in joy but in habit, as if they too had survived the long dark and simply resumed where they had left off. Carts rolled once more through mud-rutted paths, carrying smoked meats to neighbors or bundles of wool to the trading posts. The fabric might be coarse, the colors muted, but in every thread there was effort. The careful spin of fingers in candlelight, the rhythm of a loom in a cold room. And as people passed each other on the paths, they didn't speak of suffering. They didn't have to. A glance, a nod, that was enough. A shared language born not of words, but of mutual survival. Of knowing that both of you had seen the same storms, eaten the same thin soup, heard the same wolves. And still, you were walking. Still, you were here. But even with spring's promise, the memory of winter never left them. It lingered in the backs of their minds like smoke in old fur. It shaped their choices, what to plant, what to store, what to fear. They knew the sun was only renting its place in the sky. They knew it would leave again. So the Vikings prepared, not out of panic, but out of respect. Winter was not an enemy to be beaten. It was a teacher, a sculptor of souls. It had chiseled away the softness and left behind only what could endure. And in that endurance, there was a kind of peace. Fathers taught their sons how to spot the signs of rot in buried root vegetables. Mothers taught their daughters how to stretch a stew with bark and dried berries, and how to hide sweetness in the smallest spoonfuls. The elderly, those who had seen more winters than most, became libraries of survival, quiet, creased repositories of how to make boots last another season, or where the moss grew warmest for bedding. These lessons were not written, they were whispered, repeated softly over firelight and wool, passed down like blessings. Not sacred because they were profound, but because they were practical, because they saved lives. And then came the storms, not of snow, but of wind and rain, the wild tantrums of a sky learning to be warm again. The thatched roofs leaked, the paths turned to sludge, and still, life pushed forward. With every passing day, the sun lingered just a little longer. The light, though weak, returned to the eyes of the people. Not in wide smiles, but in a softened furrow of the brow, a moment where someone would look up and pause, as if remembering what blue looked like. And sometimes late at night, when the fire was down to glowing embers, someone would hum a song, not for others to hear, but just for themselves. A lullaby meant to carry the soul gently towards sleep, a reminder that no winter, no matter how cruel, was permanent. Because here they were. The longhouse still stood, the breath still fogged, the stories still lived. And in the quiet, the Vikings understood something that many forget, that survival, when shared, is its own kind of glory. The final days of winter, though slowly brightening, carried a strange heaviness. Not the punishing cold of January, nor the deep stillness of December, but something quieter and sadder. Like the farewell of an old friend, one who had overstayed their welcome, but whose absence would somehow feel unsettling. The Vikings didn't celebrate the end of winter with trumpets or feasts. They acknowledged it in subtler ways. A thinning of the woodpile, a loosened scarf, the cautious opening of a long-sealed door. Children, blinking into the pale sunlight, were reminded how loud birds could be. Their ears, tuned for creaking beams and crackling fire, had nearly forgotten the sound of thaw. Outside, the world was trying to remember itself. Rivers once locked in silence began to babble again. Snow turned to slush and revealed things lost. A dropped knife handle, a broken toy carved from bone, the hoofprints of an elk months gone. The land felt bruised but breathing, and everywhere there was the slow-motion miracle of return. Inside the longhouse, life reoriented. Straw bedding was fluffed and replaced. Molded edges of cheese were trimmed off. Salted meat, though tough and metallic, was eaten gratefully and in silence. The grain stores, always a worry, were counted with held breath. How much had survived? How many mouths could be fed for just a few days more? Hunger lingered, not as an emergency, but as a presence, a shadow in the corner of the eye. It made every task more fragile. A man chopping wood grew faint quicker. A mother sewing leather gloves had to pause, hand trembling. Even laughter, when it came, was thin, a spark, not a flame. Yet still, the people endured, and not merely endured, but adapted. They found ways to coax joy out of scarcity. A stew made from the last carrot and a spoonful of barley became a shared event. A single apple, preserved by chance, was sliced into pieces so small they felt like communion. The Vikings were not gluttons. They were guardians of resilience. Elders would gather the children and tell stories, not just of gods and monsters, but of winters past. Of the year the sea froze, or the winter the wolves walked the roads. These weren't just legends. They were memory turned into myth, survival reframed as legacy. And as the fire crackled low, young eyes would widen, not in fear, but in reverence. Because to have survived was to be initiated. To wake up, aching and cold, and still stretch your arms to the rising sun, this was a kind of victory. To feel the wooden floor under your bare feet and know it hadn't cracked. To bury another fallen chicken and still find 2 eggs the next morning. Small wins, but wins nonetheless. Spring, when it finally arrived, did not come in bursts of color. It crept in slowly like a shy guest, a patch of moss here, a drip of water there, and with it, the smallest gifts, the first blade of green. The smell of thawed earth, the return of crows nesting in the eaves. No songs were sung, no parades were held, just the quiet acknowledgement that life somehow had continued. And that was enough. That had always been enough. Among the lesser-known hardships of a Viking winter was the isolation. While the biting cold and lack of food were physical torments, the silence could gnaw just as deeply. The sea, once a bustling avenue of trade, exploration, and battle, became a frozen wall, locking in entire communities. Ships, drawn up onto the land and draped in frost, stood like sleeping beasts, useless and still. Sailors and warriors who once faced storms with laughter now struggled with stillness, their minds restless, fingers twitching for ropes they could not throw and oars they could not pull. Inside the longhouses, space grew tighter, not because the buildings shrank, but because the weight of waiting stretched time. People had learned to keep busy. Women spun wool, men carved tools or mended what could still be mended. But even the most diligent hands would still, from time to time, fall still. A man might sit staring at the fire's slow dance and feel it, the creeping dread that perhaps this winter would never end. Or worse, that spring would come too late for someone they loved. The Vikings were practical, but not emotionless. They mourned in quiet ways. A daughter who hadn't survived the fevers of midwinter might be remembered with a carved pendant worn beneath the tunic. A father lost on an autumn voyage might be honored by lighting the hearth with his flint stone, even if others believed it foolish superstition. Grief lived in gestures, in silent rituals, in stories half told and unfinished. And yet the winter taught them more than pain. It taught them rhythm, to listen to the land's slow breath, to mark the return of ravens and read their flight for signs, to watch how the ice cracked, sharp, sudden, and then still, like an omen. There was a kind of wisdom to winter, buried in its long hours, waiting to be uncovered by those willing to listen. Sometimes the wind would rise in the dead of night and howl through the beams of the longhouse like a voice. Children, wide-eyed and buried in wool, would clutch their blankets and whisper, "The gods are speaking." The old ones would nod, not to frighten them, but because they too had once believed, and part of them still did. Because in a world where everything was uncertain, crops, fish, even the sun, belief was a blanket against the cold. Not always warm, but always there. Then came the slow return of color. Not the bold greens of summer, but the first grays of melting snow. A brown stalk of grass stubbornly poking through the ice, a smear of yellow lichen on the stones. These were not just signs of spring, they were promises mattered. When the ice cracked in the fjords, it did not whisper, it sang, loud, deep groans that rolled across the valleys like thunder from beneath the world. The sea reawakened, and with it, the people. Boots were repaired, sails were patched, oars were lifted from where they had slept, their smooth handles still carrying the ghosts of past voyages. But the return to the sea was never rushed. The first trips out were tentative, not for conquest or glory, but for reassurance. A man would dip his hand in the water and feel the cold bite of life, the same water that had fed, taken, blessed, and cursed them. Still here, still waiting. And when they sailed once more, it wasn't always toward adventure. Sometimes it was just to feel the wind again, to hear the creak of the hull and the slap of waves and know in their bones that they had made it. They had endured another winter, not because they were the strongest, but because they were willing to suffer, to wait, to hope. And in the end, wasn't that the heart of all Viking stories? Not just the battles and the bloodshed, but the waiting, the quiet, painful waiting, for the world to be kind again. The children of the North, growing up under the shadow of such long winters, learned their world not in lessons from parchment, but in the warmth of stories whispered beneath fur blankets. Every flicker of the hearth cast dancing shapes on the beams above, and in those shadows, sagas lived and breathed. They heard of giants that walked across the snowdrifts, of spirits that lingered in the frost, of gods who could bring warmth or hunger with the curl of a finger. Whether the tales were true was less important than how they held the cold at bay. In the stillness of night, when the wind moaned like an old woman grieving across the frozen hills, the stories became shields, and in the eyes of the young, wonder bloomed like flowers in snow. But the elders, their hands gnarled from years of rope and axe, knew there were no monsters greater than time. Winter warped time, stretched it, folded it, slowed it, until days and weeks blurred into a quiet struggle. It was easy to forget the count of mornings when the sky remained the same bleak grey, offering neither sun nor snow, just a dull and endless hush. And in that hush, thoughts turned inward. Even the strongest warriors, whose swords had split the air with song in distant lands, found themselves staring into the fire and remembering. A brother lost at sea. A friend who didn't return from a raid. A child whose laughter had once echoed in this very hall. Winter did not ask for mourning, it demanded it. It left no room for pretense. In its silence, it uncovered every buried sorrow. To cope, some turned to the gods, not in desperation, but in ritual. Offerings were made in frozen groves, a sliver of bread, a carved rune, the breath of a whispered prayer rising like mist into the sky. They didn't expect miracles, but in these small acts, they found meaning. A sense that the world, no matter how cruel or cold, was still watching. Others turned to craft. A man might carve the same wooden pattern 100 times, not because he needed it, but because the rhythm of it kept his heart steady.